During the Great Depression, when jobs disappeared and winters felt longer and colder than ever, families had to survive on almost nothing. But somehow, Grandma always found a way. With just a few ingredients, a warm stove, and a whole lot of love, she made meals that kept everyone going. These were not fancy recipes. They were made from potatoes, beans, bread, and whatever was left in the pantry. Yet they fed bodies and lifted spirits during some of the hardest times in American history. In this video, we are honoring the strength, creativity, and heart of that generation by sharing 21 of the most common and comforting winter meals Grandma made to help her family survive. These dishes may be simple, but they hold deep meaning. They tell the story of survival, of care, and of making something out of almost nothing. Let us take a step back in time and remember how food became love in the toughest of times. 1. Potato soup. Potato soup was a lifeline for many families during the Great Depression, especially in the cold winter months. It was affordable, filling, and easy to make, even when supplies were running low. For Grandma, it started with a few humble ingredients: potatoes, water, salt, and maybe a bit of onion or milk, if she had some on hand. She would peel and dice the potatoes, simmer them slowly on the stove, and mash a portion to thicken the broth. There was rarely meat involved, but sometimes, if she had bacon grease saved from a previous meal, she would add a spoonful to deepen the flavor. The soup might be thin, but it was hot, and when served with a piece of stale bread or a biscuit, it became a full meal. Children would huddle around the table, hands wrapped around chipped bowls, steam rising to warm their faces. It was not just food, it was comfort, it was care, it was survival in a bowl. Even today, that simple taste can take someone back to a time when love and resourcefulness mattered more than anything else. 2. Cornbread and milk. Sometimes dinner was nothing more than a slice of leftover cornbread crumbled into a bowl and covered in milk. It may sound strange to us now, but during the Great Depression, this was a common, nourishing, and deeply comforting meal. Families who could afford a bit of cornmeal would bake cornbread in large iron skillets, serving it fresh on Sundays and eating the leftovers throughout the week. When there was no meat and vegetables were scarce, Grandma would soften the old bread in cold milk, sometimes sweetening it with a touch of sugar or molasses if it was available. For many children, this was both dinner and dessert. When milk was not available, they used water or watered-down evaporated milk. There was no waste. Every crumb mattered. While simple, this dish carried a sense of routine and warmth, a way to fill a belly without emptying the pantry. It reminded families that even in the hardest times, food could still feel like home. Cornbread and milk was proof that love could be served in the most humble of bowls. 3. Fried potato cakes. Nothing went to waste in Grandma's kitchen, especially not leftover mashed potatoes. When there was just a bit left from the night before, she would turn them into crispy fried potato cakes. These were made by mixing cold mashed potatoes with a little flour or cornmeal and sometimes a cracked egg if she had one. She would season it lightly with salt and pepper, form small patties, and fry them in bacon grease or lard saved from earlier meals. The sizzle from the skillet brought everyone into the kitchen. The cakes came out golden and crispy on the outside, warm and soft on the inside. They were often served for breakfast or as a side with whatever else she could find, sometimes beans, sometimes canned tomatoes. These potato cakes were not just frugal, they were delicious and comforting. They made something out of almost nothing. And they taught us that creativity was not just about art or invention. It was about finding a way to make your family feel full, even when the cupboards were nearly bare. 4. Cabbage and dumplings. Cabbage and dumplings was one of those dishes that appeared again and again on Depression-era tables, not because it was fancy, but because it was cheap, hearty, and surprisingly satisfying. Cabbage was inexpensive, available even in winter and full of fiber. Grandma would chop it into thick ribbons and boil or sauté it slowly in a bit of water or broth if she had some bones left over from another meal. Once the cabbage softened, she would drop in homemade dumplings made from flour, water, and maybe a pinch of salt or baking powder. These doughy pieces would puff up in the pot, soaking in the flavor of the cabbage and broth. There was no meat, no spices. But the result was warm, soft, and filling, a dish that made you feel cared for. Sometimes she would add a splash of vinegar at the end to give it brightness. This was a dish born of scarcity, but delivered with love. It filled the belly and reminded the family that they still had each other. And that was enough. 5. Beans and cornbread. Beans and cornbread was a staple meal that appeared on tables across America during the Great Depression. It was cheap, packed with protein, and could stretch to feed an entire family for days. Grandma would soak dry beans, usually pinto, navy, or black-eyed peas, overnight, then simmer them slowly in a large pot. If she had an old ham bone, a bit of salt pork, or even just bacon grease, she would add it for flavor. Otherwise, the beans stood on their own with a little salt, onion, or maybe a bay leaf. The smell of beans cooking all day on the stove brought warmth to the house even when the outside air was freezing. Alongside the pot of beans, she would bake a skillet of cornbread made from scratch, cornmeal, a bit of lard, baking soda, and buttermilk or water. The cornbread was crisp on the edges, soft in the middle, and perfect for soaking up the rich bean broth. This meal was not just about filling stomachs. It was about keeping hope alive, one warm bite at a time. 6. Depression-era meatloaf. Meatloaf was a special treat during the Great Depression, not because it was rich in meat, but because it managed to make just a little meat go a very long way. In most cases, Grandma would have less than half a pound of ground beef or pork, and she would stretch it by mixing in crushed saltine crackers, oats, cornmeal, or even leftover bread soaked in milk or water. She added whatever she had, onions, a bit of ketchup, a spoonful of mustard, or an egg if it was available, to bind it all together. It was then shaped into a loaf and baked until browned on top. Meatloaf was often served with boiled potatoes or canned vegetables on the side. This version of meatloaf was not about indulgence. It was about resourcefulness. The flavor came from stretching and seasoning, from layering love into every step. And despite the lack of ingredients, it filled the home with a smell that made everyone feel like they were going to be okay. It was survival food with the illusion of abundance. A little meat, a lot of heart. 7. Lard or onion sandwiches. When there was no meat, no cheese, and barely enough bread, families during the Great Depression turned to the simplest meals imaginable, like lard or onion sandwiches. Grandma would take 2 thin slices of homemade bread and spread them with cooled bacon grease or plain lard. If she had onions, she would slice them paper thin and lay them between the slices. The sandwich was plain, even harsh to modern tastes, but back then it was a blessing. The fat gave calories and kept people full longer. The onions added flavor and made the meal feel like something more. There was no refrigeration, no deli counter, no fresh ingredients every day. This sandwich might have been eaten in silence, sometimes shame, but it also represented the resilience of families who simply refused to give up. It taught children to be grateful, to eat what was available, and to understand that food is not just for pleasure, it is for survival. And in those thin slices was a mother's effort to protect her children from hunger. 8. Macaroni and tomatoes. Macaroni and tomatoes was one of those simple, affordable dishes that showed up on dinner tables week after week. Made with just elbow macaroni and canned stewed tomatoes, this dish was fast, easy, and shockingly satisfying. Grandma would boil the macaroni until just soft, then drain and combine it with stewed tomatoes she had either canned herself or gotten cheap at the store. Sometimes she would add a spoonful of bacon grease or a splash of milk to add richness. A pinch of salt and pepper went a long way. When cheese was available, a little bit sprinkled on top made it feel like something truly special. But even without it, the dish was warm, filling, and familiar. It was a meal that could feed many on very little, often served in large bowls with a slice of bread. This dish reminded families that comfort does not have to be complicated. It was the kind of meal that kids would later remember, not because it was gourmet, but because it tasted like home in hard times. 9. Navy bean soup. Navy bean soup was a staple in Depression-era kitchens, especially during the winter months. Dry navy beans were cheap, stored well, and provided essential protein and fiber. Grandma would soak the beans overnight, then cook them slowly on the stove in a large pot of water, adding what she had, maybe an onion, a carrot, a bay leaf, or if she was lucky, a leftover ham bone or piece of salt pork. The beans would simmer for hours, filling the home with a warm, savory aroma that brought comfort even before the first spoonful was tasted. Often, the soup was served with cornbread or a slice of day-old bread. Sometimes, it would stretch into multiple meals, reheated day after day, growing thicker and richer each time. It was not fancy, but it was hearty. It filled the belly, warmed the body, and reminded families that even a pot of beans could be enough when made with patience and care. Navy bean soup was a quiet hero in many households, a bowl of strength in a time of scarcity. 10. Egg drop soup, flour and water base. When ingredients were almost gone and winter had no mercy, Grandma would make a very basic version of egg drop soup. Not the Chinese variety with spices and stock, but a humble Depression-era version made from water, flour, and one precious egg. She would boil water, whisk in a bit of flour to thicken it slightly, and then carefully drizzle in a beaten egg while stirring. The egg would cook into delicate ribbons, floating in the warm, starchy liquid. It was plain, it was thin, but it was warm and provided just enough protein and energy to keep the family going. Sometimes, if she had access to broth or a bouillon cube, she would use that instead of water to add flavor. A pinch of salt or a crack of pepper made a difference. Children might not have liked it at first, but over time, they learned that this bowl meant they would not go to bed hungry. It was a humble soup, born out of necessity, but made with hands that never stopped trying. 11. Hoover stew. Hoover stew was a dish born out of true desperation, but also out of community kitchens and government relief programs. Named after President Herbert Hoover, unfairly or not, this stew became a staple at soup kitchens and in working-class homes during the Great Depression. It was not really a stew in the traditional sense. It was more of a creative combination of whatever could be found and stretched to feed a family. Grandma would boil macaroni noodles until soft, then mix them with stewed tomatoes, canned corns or beans, and sliced hot dogs or any cheap sausage available. Sometimes everything was cooked in one big pot, other times in stages. The result was a hearty, tangy, salty mix of pasta, vegetables, and bits of meat. Nothing fancy, but very filling. Kids loved it because of the noodles and sausage, and adults appreciated how far it could stretch. One pot could last for days. Hoover stew was a survival meal, but also a reflection of working-class ingenuity, the ability to take scraps and create something that brought warmth to the table. 12. Boiled cabbage with vinegar. Boiled cabbage with vinegar might sound simple, and it was. But for many families, it was a lifeline during winter. Cabbage was cheap, lasted a long time in cold storage, and was available when other vegetables were not. Grandma would chop the cabbage into wedges or slices and boil it in water until tender. She might add a pinch of salt, and if she had it, a splash of bacon grease or leftover broth to add some depth of flavor. But what really brought the dish to life was a splash of vinegar, white or apple cider, poured over the top before serving. It added tang, brightness, and a sense that this humble plate had a spark of something special. Often, this dish was served with cornbread or boiled potatoes, and sometimes with a slice of onion or a fried egg on the side. The smell of cabbage cooking filled the house, not always pleasantly, but the warmth and nourishment it provided made it a familiar and welcome part of winter life. 13. Fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was a common and very affordable food during the Depression, especially in colder months when bellies needed filling, but wallets were empty. Grandma would cook the cornmeal slowly in salted water until it thickened into a porridge-like consistency. It was usually eaten soft for breakfast, but when there were leftovers, and there usually were, she would pour the mush into a loaf pan and let it set overnight in the cold kitchen. The next morning, she would slice the firm cornmeal into rectangles and fry them in a pan until the outside was crispy and golden. Sometimes they were served with syrup, jam, or even just a sprinkle of sugar. Other times, they were eaten plain or with a fried egg. Fried cornmeal mush was versatile, inexpensive, and surprisingly satisfying. It was a way to stretch a basic grain into multiple meals, one soft and warm, one crisp and hearty. It taught families to waste nothing and to appreciate even the simplest ingredients. 14. Chipped beef on toast. Chipped beef on toast, known more informally and humorously as SOS by military veterans, short for stuff on a shingle, was a dish that fed soldiers and civilians alike. During the Great Depression, it became a regular dinner in many households because it was cheap, salty, and could feed a crowd. Grandma would make a simple white sauce out of flour, lard, or butter, and milk. If she had fresh milk, she would use it, but more often it was canned or watered-down evaporated milk. Into the sauce, she would stir in thin slices of dried, salted beef, often from a jar or small packet. Once the mixture thickened, she would ladle it over toasted bread. It was creamy, salty, and filling, and when served hot, it felt like a real meal. This was not elegant food, but it kept the family warm, and it made use of cheap, preserved meat. It was another reminder that a cook's skill was not in what she had, but in what she could do with very little. 15. Baked apples or stewed fruit. Even when money was tight, Grandma believed in having a little sweetness to end a meal. One of the most common Depression-era desserts in winter was baked apples or stewed fruit. Fresh fruit was rare and precious in the cold months, but apples stored well and dried or canned fruits were often used instead. To make baked apples, she would core them, fill them with a mix of oats, sugar, and maybe a bit of cinnamon, then bake them until soft and bubbling. When apples were not available, she would stew prunes, raisins, or dried peaches in water with a spoonful of sugar until they became syrupy and tender. Sometimes, if milk or cream was on hand, it was poured over the top as a special touch. These simple desserts were more than just sweets. They were a signal that even in the hardest times, joy still had a place at the table. They reminded children that there would always be something warm, something kind, waiting at the end of the day. 16. Rice and raisins, or rice pudding. Rice and raisins was a humble yet comforting dish that often doubled as both breakfast and dessert. It was one of those meals that stretched a small amount of rice into something sweet, nourishing, and satisfying. Grandma would cook white rice in water or thin milk until it was soft and creamy. Then she would stir in a handful of raisins, often the only sweetness available in the pantry. If there was a bit of sugar, cinnamon, or vanilla on hand, she would add a pinch to elevate the flavor. On good days, she might even top it with a splash of milk or a small pat of butter. Served warm in chipped bowls, this dish brought smiles to the table. It reminded children that even in hard times, there was still room for comfort. And when rice pudding was made by baking the same ingredients slowly in the oven, with the top forming a soft, golden skin, it felt like a true treat. It was a dish born from limitations, but flavored with love. 17. Pinto beans and rice. Pinto beans and rice was a Depression-era staple that families turned to again and again, especially in southern and southwestern states. It was cheap, simple, and highly nutritious, providing both protein and energy for a long, cold day. Grandma would soak the dry pinto beans overnight, then boil them slowly with onions, garlic, and, if available, a ham bone or leftover bacon fat for extra flavor. While the beans simmered on the stove, she would prepare a big pot of rice. The two were then served side by side or mixed together. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was usually all it needed, though if she had some chili powder or cumin, she would add a pinch. This was not just a poor person's meal. It was smart cooking. It made use of bulk staples, created no waste, and filled every hungry stomach in the house. Even today, beans and rice remain one of the most budget-friendly meals around. And its roots run deep in the stories of families who had to make every grain count. 18. Oatmeal with water or weak milk. Oatmeal was a daily ritual in many homes during the Great Depression, especially in the winter when a hot breakfast made all the difference. While oatmeal today may be flavored with maple syrup, berries, or nuts, back then it was often made with just oats, water, and a little salt. If Grandma had access to milk, she would dilute it to make it stretch farther, what many called weak milk. On rare occasions, she might sweeten the pot with a spoonful of sugar or molasses, or add chopped apples or raisins. But most of the time, it was plain and practical. Oats were affordable, stored well, and kept bellies full until lunch. Children might complain, but they ate every spoonful because they knew how rare even a simple bowl of warm cereal could be. And despite its simplicity, there was a quiet strength in that morning meal. It was a symbol of routine, of care, and of starting the day with something warm in your stomach, even if everything else felt cold. 19. Bread pudding, using stale bread. Nothing ever went to waste in Grandma's kitchen, especially not stale bread. Bread pudding was a Depression-era favorite because it turned scraps into something delicious and meaningful. The recipe was flexible and forgiving. Chunks of old bread soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and spices if available. Once soaked and softened, the bread mixture was baked in the oven until golden and custard-like inside. On special days, Grandma might add raisins, cinnamon, or even a drizzle of syrup or cream over the top. The smell alone could warm the house and lift the mood. It was often served as dessert, but also made a satisfying breakfast. Bread pudding taught families that even the leftovers of leftovers could be transformed into something comforting. It was a celebration of frugality and love, the idea that care is not measured by how much you have, but by how well you use it. Many who grew up with this dish still crave its rich simplicity and the memories baked inside every bite. 20. Vegetable peel soup. Perhaps the ultimate example of Depression-era resourcefulness, vegetable peel soup was created from what most people today would throw away. In those days, nothing was wasted, not even the peels from potatoes, carrots, turnips, or onions. Grandma would collect them throughout the week, storing them in a cool tin or bucket, then boil them into a simple broth. She might add a clove of garlic, a pinch of salt, or a small piece of fat for flavor. Sometimes she would strain out the peels and add a bit of rice or noodles to make it more filling. The soup was light, but it was warm and made from pure determination. It was not just a meal, it was a message. We will not give up. We will use every bit we have to make it through. That pot of peelings simmering on the back of the stove was a symbol of survival, a lesson in humility, and a quiet act of defiance against hunger. It was proof that love could be found in the most unexpected places, even in a pot of scraps. 21. Salt, pork, and beans. Salt pork and beans was one of the more luxurious Depression-era meals, often reserved for the end of the week or when families had a bit more to spare. Salt pork was a fatty, heavily salted cut of pork that was cheap, preserved well without refrigeration, and packed flavor. Grandma would fry it gently to release its fat, Then cook dry beans, usually navy or pinto, in that flavorful base. The beans would simmer for hours, soaking up every bit of richness. Sometimes, a bit of molasses or onion was added if it was on hand. Served with a wedge of cornbread or a piece of crusty bread, this dish was hearty, smoky, and satisfying. Though meat was scarce, salt pork allowed families to feel like they were eating something substantial. It was a way to add soul to beans and dignity to the dinner table. This dish represented something more than just calories. It represented a small victory, a warm, full belly, and a mother's unyielding will to keep her family fed no matter the cost.